The gavel came down, and Dale Pruitt threw his head back, one thick hand slapping the top of the auction rail, so hard it left a red mark on his palm, he wouldn't notice until he was in the car. His laugh was the kind that fills a space bigger than the man, the kind that the people around him smiled at reflexively without knowing why, the way you smile when a truck engine turns over on a cold morning. It just tells you something is running. The man who had bid $90 on the safe did not look at Dale Pruitt. He looked at the safe. It sat on a wooden pallet at Lot 47, third row in from the back fence of the Dillard County estate sale on Route 9 outside Carlin, Tennessee, on the 9th of November, 1979. The morning was the kind of cold that gets into the seams of your coat. The safe was roughly the size of a steamer trunk, manufactured somewhere between 1938 and 1945 if you knew what to look for, and the fire that had warped it had done its work on the upper left corner, and the dial housing in a way that left everything buckled and scorched the color of old blood. The door seam had swollen. The hinges had held, which told you something. The dial was fused at the 11 o'clock position, which told you something else entirely. The handle was there. The handle had not melted. The handle was the first thing the man had seen from 40 feet away when he came through the gate and had not yet finished deciding what he was looking at. Dale Pruitt's voice was meant to travel. He made sure of it. You got yourself a hell of a planter box there, Eldon. The crowd, such as it was, maybe 30 people standing in the cold between lots of depression glass and furniture, and the tools of a man nobody much remembered anymore. They let out the kind of half-laugh that a crowd gives when the loud man says something they're not sure is funny. Eldon Marsh did not look up. He was already walking toward the pallet. Eldon Marsh was 63 years old and had been reading locks for 41 of them. He had learned the trade from a man named Harlan Voss, who ran a one-room shop on Ketterman Street in Bluefield, West Virginia, and who had told him on the first day, before he had touched a single thing, to sit down and listen. Harlan Voss said, "A lock is a conversation between the man who made it and the man who needs it open. Your job is to learn the language well enough to join that conversation, not interrupt it. Join it." Eldon had kept that in his chest for 41 years. He had not written it down. He did not need to. His hands by 1979 were the hands of a man who has spent 4 decades in close contact with metal. The knuckles were swollen in the way that doesn't hurt anymore unless the weather changes fast. There was a scar across the base of his right thumb from a slip with a carbide burr in 1962 that had required 11 stitches from a doctor in Roanoke, who told him he was lucky he still had the thumb. The grime in the creases of his palms was the permanent kind, the kind that soap reaches but does not remove, the mineral kind that gets into skin and becomes part of it. He kept his nails short with a file he carried in his breast pocket, the same file for 16 years, the handle wrapped in electrical tape where the original plastic had cracked. He had run Marsh Lock and Safe out of a converted garage on Prater Road in Dennistown, Tennessee, for 31 years. No sign except the letters painted on the window in black by his late wife Cecile, who had a steady hand for that kind of work. He did residential, commercial, safe installation, safe recovery, automotive, and estate work. He did not advertise except in the yellow pages with a single line. He had been offered twice what the building was worth by a developer in 1976 and had not returned the man's second call. The world had moved toward combination change digital units by the time he stood at that auction in 1979. Most of the work had quietly gone somewhere else. He was not unaware of this. He showed up anyway, every morning, same time, same coffee from the same diner 3 blocks over. He bought the safe anyway. What Dale Pruitt had seen from across that lot was a ruined appliance. A liability. A piece of scorched furniture that would cost more to move than it was worth empty. And it was certainly empty. Any fool could see that a safe that had sat in a hotel fire and been left unclaimed for 11 years was empty. The hotel had been the Carlin Arms, for stories on Merchant Street, burned in the spring of 1968, and whatever had been in that safe had either burned or been removed or amounted to nothing in the first place. You look at a thing that warped, and you make your conclusion. That is how most men operate. Eldon Marsh had made his conclusion too. He had made it in less than 10 seconds from 40 feet away. What he had seen was this: the handle. Not bent, not melted, not seized. A fire hot enough to buckle the door surround and fuse the dial face would have done something to a handle mounted flush to the door, unless the handle was Pratt & Whitney grade naval brass, which had a melting point that put it outside the range of a structural hotel fire. Nobody put Pratt& Whitney brass on a cheap safe. Nobody put Pratt & Whitney brass on an unimportant safe. Then closer, at maybe 20 feet, the hinge exposure. Most fire-damaged safes shear at the hinge plates when they cool too fast. These hinges were clean at the plate joint, which meant the steel in the door itself was continuous poured, not laminated. Continuous poured doors were expensive. Continuous poured doors were ordered for a reason. Then the dial housing. Fused at 11 o'clock. A safe that has been opened and left open during a fire does not fuse the dial. A safe that has been closed, specifically locked, during a fire fuses the dial at whatever position the last hand left it. Someone had locked this safe before the fire or during it. That was not an accident. To Dale Pruitt, the thing was a ruin sitting on a pallet in the cold. To Eldon Marsh, it was a sealed letter written in the only language he had spent his whole life learning. He found two men near the gate who helped him get it onto the flatbed of his F-100 for $5 each. He checked the straps twice. He had a specific way of checking straps that Harlan Voss had shown him, a method of pressing your palm flat against the strap and feeling for the tension that lives in a correctly loaded strap versus one that is merely tight. He drove home on Route 9 and then on Prater Road at 37 miles an hour. He did not hurry. There was no reason to hurry. A thing that had been sealed for 11 years was going to wait another 45 minutes. There is a kind of patience that looks like weakness right up until the moment it doesn't. And Eldon Marsh had a whole lifetime of it strapped down in the bed of that truck. The Carlin Arms Hotel had been built in 1921 by a man named Roscoe Drummond, who had come to Carlin with capital from a timber operation in Kentucky that had lasted 12 years and ended the way most timber operations ended. Not badly, but completely, the land having given what it was going to give. Drummond was 51 years old when he broke ground on Merchant Street, and he was done with the extractive life. He wanted to build something that would stay. He had run the Carlin Arms for 31 years, through the Depression with the rates cut to what a family of four could manage for a week, without choosing between that and eating, through the war when the hotel served as overflow accommodation for the families of men doing training at Fort Campbell, and later for the men themselves on leave, through the post-war years when Carlin began to grow in the small, determined way that mid-sized Tennessee towns grew in the 1950s. By 1952, when Drummond was 82 years old and his son Calvin had taken over the daily operation, the Carlin Arms had 44 rooms and the only dining room in the county that served on white linen 7 days a week. Roscoe Drummond died in 1954. Calvin ran the hotel for another 14 years, through the slow drift of traffic away from Merchant Street and toward the new motor lodges on the highway bypass, and through whatever private trouble had settled into the walls of the Carlin Arms by 1968. And then on the 14th of March of that year, a fire started in the laundry room on the second floor at approximately 11 at night and ran through the third floor before the fire department arrived and was controlled by 2 in the morning. And the hotel never reopened. Calvin Drummond was 58 years old when the hotel burned. He had one daughter, Margaret, who had moved to Knoxville in 1963 and married a man named Hargrove. The insurance settlement on the Carlin Arms had been disputed and then litigated and then partially settled and then appealed, and the building had sat empty on Merchant Street for 3 years before being demolished in 1971, and the safe, which had been in the hotel office on the ground floor and had survived the fire largely intact, had gone into county storage and then been declared surplus and ended up on the pallet at the Dillard County estate sale in 1979. That is how things end up where they end up. While the safe sat in county storage, Dale Pruitt had been building. His operation, Pruitt Salvage and Lock, on the highway between Carlin and Dennistown, had expanded twice in the 1970s, a new bay added in 1973 and a second one in 1977, and the chrome on the signage caught the afternoon light in a way that Pruitt made sure to point out to anyone who came through, the way a man points out the new addition to his house before he lets you inside. His story at the Carlin Diner on Route 9 had grown with the business. By 1979, the story of how he had saved a customer's lock situation, whatever that situation happened to have been, had accumulated details the original event did not possess. Nobody who had been there corrected him. That is how stories work. The week before the auction, the Route 9 bypass extension had opened and taken the last of the through traffic off Merchant Street. Pruitt had a line of credit with First Agricultural that had seemed sensible in 1977 and was beginning to feel different. He did not discuss this at the diner. The same week, A widow named Eunice Pardon on Hollow Creek Road had called Marsh Lock about a gate lock on her property fence that had rusted solid after 11 years of a pine tree growing against it until the bark had swallowed the shackle. A hardware store, had she gone to one, would have told her to cut the gate. Dale Pruitt, when she had called his number first by mistake, had told her the same thing and said he'd charge her $60 for the cutting and the new hardware. Eldon Marsh drove out to Hollow Creek Road on a Tuesday morning and spent an hour and 40 minutes with a penetrating oil he mixed himself, a set of needle picks he had made from bicycle spokes, and a patience that Eunice Parton watched from her porch with a look on her face that was not quite belief. The lock opened. He charged her $22 for the oil and his time. She tried to give him $30. He took $22. He wrote it in his ledger that night in pencil. The same kind of pencil he had used since he started the ledger. Now, if you have ever watched a quiet, capable person get written off by a loud one, if you have ever known a man whose work the world stopped valuing while he kept doing it right anyway, then you already understand what this channel is about. Take a second to subscribe, because the people who stay for stories like Eldon Marsh's are exactly who this channel was built for. He did not try to open the safe that first night. He rolled it off the truck with the help of a neighbor's boy, a 16-year-old named Gary who did odd work on Prater Road, and who asked Eldon what was in it, and who received the answer that Eldon didn't know yet in a tone that settled the question completely. They got it into the garage on the wheeled dolly, and Gary went home, and Eldon stood in front of it for approximately 4 minutes with his arms at his sides, and then he covered it with a canvas tarp and went inside and ate supper. He was a widower. Cecile had died in the winter of 1974 of a cancer that moved faster than the treatments available to them. She had been 54 years old. He had learned what grief teaches a man, which is that not all closed things should be forced, and that waiting is not the same as giving up, and that the difference between patience and giving up is whether you come back tomorrow. Every evening for the first 2 weeks, he would go into the garage after supper and sit in the wooden chair he kept 3 feet from the safe and look at it. He would take the canvas off and look at it, and he would bring his small inspection lamp on the long cord, and he would go over the door surround with his fingers, reading the warpage the way a man reads Braille, not with thought at first, but with touch, letting the information come. He learned the buckle pattern of the upper left corner. He learned the specific angle at which the door had swollen into its frame, which was not uniform, which told him the heat had come from a specific direction, which told him the dial side of the safe had been facing away from the fire's source, which meant the dial mechanism had been partially protected, which changed the problem entirely. He set it back. He put the canvas on. He went inside. A man who has buried a wife learns that some things open when they are ready and not a day before. And he is a fool who pries. By the 6th week, he had mapped every square inch of the door surround in his head the way you map a road you drive every day, not by thinking about it, but by the absence of surprise. He knew where the buckle was worst, which was the 2-inch section running parallel to the upper hinge plate. He knew where the door still held true to its original geometry, which was a strip of roughly 4 inches running from the lower right corner to the center. He knew the gap at the seal, which varied from a hair's width at the bottom to almost a 1/16 of an inch at the top, and he knew what that variation told him about the direction the heat had pressed the door into its frame, and therefore which bolt was bearing the most stress, and which bolt had the most chance of being coaxed free without force. He ordered 2 Mosler catalog sheets from a supply house in Cincinnati, and spent 3 evenings reading them with the inspection lamp tilted so the light caught the paper at a low angle, the way you read where on a surface. He found the safe's probable manufacture date narrowed to a 14-month window between the spring of 1939 and the summer of 1940. He found the wheel pack specification he was looking for on page 11 of the second catalog sheet, a footnote in small print about a design change made after complaints from hoteliers about dial sensitivity in humid environments. The footnote told him exactly what to listen for. He folded the catalog sheets and put them in the drawer under the bench. A man who has buried a wife learns that some things open when they are ready and not a day before. And he is a fool who pries. Dale Pruitt's second bay, in the meanwhile, sat 30% empty through the winter of 1979 and into 1980. The chrome sign caught the light the same as it had. 2 of his 3 employees went down to 1.5 by February, which is to say 1 man full-time and another who came when called. Pruitt told the story at the diner with the same volume but a new edge to it, a sharpness that had not been in the original telling, the way a blade gets sharper as you remove material from it. It was in March of 1980 that Eldon asked Gary to come by after school. Gary Tolliver was 17 by then, with hands that were starting to carry the promise of what they'd be in 20 years, wide in the palm, the fingers already precise in a way. That had nothing to do with instruction. He had come around the shop on his own the previous summer and had watched Eldon work for 3 days before asking a single question, which was the exact quality Eldon had been watching for. The question he finally asked was about the relationship between a lock's tolerances and the feel of the wheel gates, and the question was the right one, which told Eldon everything he needed to know. Gary came after school on a Thursday in March. He sat in the second wooden chair Eldon had put out in the garage. He did not ask about the safe right away. He had learned not to do that. They talked about a modular floor model Gary had been practicing on, and about a jammed deadbolt on the school's rear gymnasium door that Gary had noticed, and which they both agreed was a Bryant Forest manufacture from around 1958 with the specific internal fault that line had been known for. Then Eldon told Gary about the Carlin arms, about Roscoe Drummond, about what he thought was inside. Gary listened the way he always listened, which was with his whole body slightly forward. When Eldon was done, Gary looked at the safe. "When are you going to open it?" Gary said. "When it's ready," Eldon said. Gary nodded like he understood, and after a moment he did. If you've made it this far into Eldon Marsh's story, hit subscribe, because what happens next is the part I've been waiting to tell you. The night they opened it was the 14th of May, 1980. 18 months and 5 days after Eldon had brought it home. The decision was not an announcement. Eldon came into the garage after supper and removed the canvas and set the inspection lamp on the high hook and called Gary, who arrived in 14 minutes on his bicycle, still in the clothes he'd worn to school and not changed out of. He was breathing harder than he let on from the ride. Eldon had 2 instruments laid on the bench. A custom ground tension wrench he had made from a clock spring in 1971 and had used on every serious dial job since. And a listening cone, not an electronic unit, a machine brass cone, 3 inches at the wide end, stem 4 inches long, that Harlan Voss had made and given to Eldon on the day he finished his apprenticeship, and that Eldon had dropped once, in 1969, and had spent 40 minutes on his hands and knees in a parking lot in the dark finding it. The listening cone pressed against the safe body and channeled the sounds from inside the dial mechanism to your ear the way a seashell channels the sounds of a room. The bare bulb on the high hook lit the garage in the way bare bulbs light garages. Hard shadows, warm center, the perimeter of the room going into uncertain dark. There was the smell of motor oil and the cold metal smell that garages accumulate, and something beneath it that was the smell of the safe itself, which was the smell of old smoke and sealed air and the mineral residue of paper and fabric and time. Gary stood to Eldon's left and back, close enough to see everything, far enough to be out of the way. Eldon placed the listening cone against the lower right quadrant of the door, where the dial mechanism transmitted through the steel with the least interference from the buckled upper corner. He placed his right ear against the wide end of the cone. He took the tension wrench in his left hand and began working the dial. Not the fused outer dial. The fused outer dial was the decoy, the outer mechanism that had caught the heat. Beneath the fused dial face, behind the housing, was the inner wheel pack, and the inner wheel pack on a safe of this age and quality and cost was a separate mechanism entirely that communicated through the spindle in a specific way that Eldon had been reading with his fingertips and his listening cone for 6 weeks on similar models he had sourced for practice. The cone told you where the wheels were. The cone told you when a gate was coming into alignment. It was not a loud sound. It was the sound of a conversation happening in a language most people did not know was being spoken. Gary did not make a sound. Eldon worked for 40 minutes. Then for another 20. Then he set the cone down and pressed his palm flat against the door and felt for what the door was telling him through the steel, which was that the lower bolt had released, but the upper was hanging in the buckled frame. He took the tension wrench again and made one specific adjustment and held it. With a sound like a held breath finally letting go, the door came open. Eldon did not reach inside. He set down the tension wrench. He straightened. He wiped his hands on the thighs of his work trousers the way a man does when he is done with the delicate part and is moving to the next, the automatic gesture of a man who has worked with his hands his whole life. He looked at the interior of the safe, and Gary came around his left shoulder and looked at it with him. The inside of the safe smelled of smoke and dry paper and something floral that had long since become only the ghost of whatever it had been. The interior lining was green felt, scorched along the upper left corner to the color of autumn grass, intact everywhere else. There were 3 things inside. Eldon took out the first one and laid it on the bench under the light. It was a document. 6 pages, folded in thirds and clipped together with a metal clip that had oxidized green. The top sheet was a deed, Dillard County Deed of Property Transfer, dated August 3, 1953, conveying the parcel at 14-20 Merchant Street, Carlin, Tennessee, including the structure known as the Carlin Arms Hotel, from Roscoe Drummond to a trust named the Drummond Community Land Trust. The deed had been witnessed and notarized and had a Dillard County recorder's stamp in the upper right corner that bore a date of September 9, 1953. The remaining pages were the articles of the trust, 2 pages each, with Roscoe Drummond's signature at the bottom of each page, the signature of a man in his 80s, deliberate, slow, the pen pressure heavy where he wanted to be certain. The second thing, a tin box, the kind that once held throat lozenges, sealed with a strip of electrical tape that had dried to nothing and fell away when Eldon touched it. Inside the tin, 44 double eagle gold coins, each minted between 1921 and 1932, each in a small paper envelope with a date written on the outside in pencil. He laid them out in a line on the bench. Gary counted them twice. 44 coins. At 1980 market value, they were worth something between $60,000 and $80,000. At the value Roscoe Drummond had understood them to represent when he put them in that tin, that was a different calculation entirely. The third thing was an envelope. On the front, in the same careful handwriting as the coin envelopes, it said, "To whoever finally has the patience to open this." Eldon read it silently first. He read it standing at the bench under the bare bulb with his hands at his sides, not touching the paper except at the edges. He read it the way he would read anything that required him to be still. Then he read it aloud to Gary. Roscoe Drummond had written, "The hotel was never mine in the way people thought it was mine. It was built from the land, and it belongs to the town that grew up around it. I have given it to a trust with the intention that the building, or its value, should the building be lost, serve Carlin in some permanent way. The coins are the operating fund. I did not trust banks in 1953, and I do not trust them now. I did not trust my son to execute this because love is not the same thing as judgment, and I loved him too much to test that theory. I have left instructions with my lawyer, but lawyers die and papers get lost, and I have learned in 83 years that the only guarantee is to make the thing survive on its own. If you are reading this, the thing survived. I will tell you what I believe, which is the only thing worth leaving behind. A man's life is worth exactly what he gave away freely and could not get back. Please find Margaret Drummond Hargrove in Knoxville. She will know what to do." Eldon read that line again to himself. Gary did not say anything. The bare bulb made a small sound above them. The sound a bulb makes when the room is otherwise quiet. He drove to Knoxville on a Saturday in early June of 1980. He had called ahead, and Margaret Hargrove had sounded on the telephone like a woman who had been carrying something heavy for a long time and had gotten used to the weight of it. She lived on a side street off Kingston Pike in a brick house with a concrete porch and a flower box under the front window that had petunias in it. She was 53 years old and looked like a woman who had been through something and had come out the other side of it quieter. Eldon stood on the porch with the envelope in one hand and the tin box in the other and the folded deed in the breast pocket of his good canvas jacket with the dark collar. She opened the door before he knocked. He said, "Mrs. Hargrove, I have something that belongs to your family." That was all. He put the deed in her hands and the tin on her porch table and the letter beside it, and he took 2 steps back to give her room. He did not go inside. When she looked up from the first page of the trust documents, her eyes were wet, and she started to say something, and Eldon put his hand up once, a short flat gesture, not unkind. He left before she could thank him. He drove home on the interstate at 60 miles an hour and stopped in Crossville for coffee at a Stuckey's and ate a pecan log because he hadn't eaten since morning, and it was now 4 in the afternoon. The trust was eventually reconstituted through a Knoxville attorney, Margaret Hargrove, found, who specialized in dormant estate law. The coins were appraised and the proceeds, $67,000 and some dollars, were placed in a municipal fund. The parcel at 14-20 Merchant Street, The lot the Carlin Arms had occupied became a small public park. The park has a bench and 2 maple trees and a concrete marker that says given by Roscoe Drummond, 1953, in trust for Carlin, Tennessee. It does not say anything about a safe or a locksmith or the November morning in 1979 when the gavel came down and a man threw his head back and laughed. Eldon Marsh continued to do what he had always done. He added the Drummond job to his ledger in pencil, in his regular small handwriting, 1 line. Carlin Arms safe, recovered contents, delivered to him. Hargrove, $0. The 0 was not a statement. It was the correct number. Gary Tolliver completed his apprenticeship in 1983 and worked alongside Eldon until 1991, when Eldon retired at 75 and handed Gary the keys to the shop on Prater Road and the ledger with 43 years of jobs in it, each one in pencil, each one with the specific number charged. Gary still has the ledger. He still uses pencil. Dale Pruitt came into Marsh Lock and Safe once, in the spring of 1984. He was older, thinner, the loudness having gone out of him the way it goes out of certain men, not in a moment, but gradually, like air from something that wasn't properly sealed. He came in because a padlock on a storage unit had seized, and he needed it opened. He did not reference the auction. He did not reference the safe. He stood at the counter and gave Gary the padlock, and Gary worked on it, and opened it in 6 minutes and rang it up. The machine opened cleanly. Pruitt paid. He glanced, once, at the far corner of the shop where the Carlin Arms safe sat open on its steel platform, the door ajar, the interior visible, the green felt lining, the scorched corner, the empty space that had held what it held for 11 years and had given it up to the right hands at the right time. He looked at it the way a man looks at something he is trying not to remember deciding about. Then he put his change in his pocket and left. And the seeing was enough. The safe is still there. Gary keeps it open, the door at a 45-degree angle, the interior light catching the felt in the afternoon when the garage door is up. Customers come in and ask about it sometimes, and Gary tells them it's a Carlin Arms safe from 1939 or 1940, and that a man named Roscoe Drummond locked it himself before a fire took everything else he'd built, and that it sat sealed for 12 years before the right man bought it for $90 on a cold morning and waited 18 months to open it correctly. He tells it plain, the same way Eldon told it to him. He has never put anything in it. It sits the way finished things sit, emptied of its purpose and at rest, its work done, the conversation it carried completed, the language spoken and received, and now quiet. So here is what I keep turning over. If you had stood in that lot on Route 9 outside Carlin, Tennessee, on the 9th of November, 1979, on that cold morning with the frost still on the grass between the rows of lot markers, would you have seen what Eldon Marsh saw from 40 feet away in the handle and the hinges and the fuse dial? Would you have known what it meant that the handle hadn't bent? Or would you have stood with Dale Pruitt, head back, hand on the rail, and let the patience and the sealed letter and the 44 coins and the deed and the old man's last careful instructions sit there on that pallet until the right hands arrived?